Right, hi everyone. I'm going to do a short video. I promised you a video on your critical review of a journal article assignment. So I just wanted to go through this quickly and give you some details. You've got a whole list of resources, and I should stress you're going to find different techniques and different variants on what I'm discussing now. So there's not one way of doing it, and you may find some overlaps, some contradictions, but I'll give you my recipe and the way I look at this. So the best way to approach this is if you're reviewing a journal article, and again here we're doing a traditional review on a traditional sort of article. The traditional article are articles that are really putting forward the results of a study. You will find articles out there that are purely theoretical. They don't actually involve data collection, and therefore they're written a little differently and they're assessed a little differently. And then, of course, you have book chapters. And book chapters are completely different. They're written in a different way. They would be assessed in a different way. So the sort of recipe I'm offering today is really only to do with traditional sort of journal articles that present results of a study, and they're assessed on that basis. So the best way to get yourself a guideline as to how to do this is to go through what do you normally expect to find in a journal article. So you would find a section which is generally introduction, context. People will call it in different ways. You may actually see 3 different sections here. In some authors, you'll see it together, but the purpose is the same. There's an introduction of the aims of the article. It talks about context, and there's sometimes a subsection around the purpose of the article, explicitly telling you what they're intending to do. So all of these would count as one section. You would then have a literature review, and you would have that in every single journal article. The point of the literature review is to tell you, I'm doing a study going forward from this point. I'm giving you an overview of everything that's happened previous to that. You would then normally, it's not always there, but it should be there. There should be a section on theoretical perspective, your theoretical position, your theoretical stance. That is sometimes there. That's not always there. Sometimes it's not explicit, but it's implicit. Sometimes it's in the lit review, in the methodology, but it should be there. Sometimes it's in the lit review because the author will actually take the time to review the literature around their theoretical position. Sometimes it's in the methodology because it orientates their methodology, and that's where they would place it. But it should be there. Sometimes it should be a separate section. Then you have a section on methodology, which subdivides into 2 subsections, a section on data collection and a section on data analysis. It should be 2 really separate parts, but obviously they're within that methodological section. And then you have a section on outcomes, which could be discussion or outcomes. In general, isn't a conclusion section in a journal article, because you're not concluding, you're actually opening the stage for other researchers to pick up where you've left and carry on further research. So out of intent, purpose, we don't call it conclusion because we're never concluding, we're opening up for other people to carry forward. So it's normally called an outcomes or a discussion section. So if we go through all this again, but this time looking at how you're going to assess that. In terms of intro, context, and purpose, you're going to assess whether that's clear. Is it clear why the question has been chosen, what the question is, what the intention of the author is? That's very important because you're going to hold them up to that standard. That's what you're going to assess against, is in the end, you will come back to that and say, has that actually been achieved? Has the author actually carried out the intention that it specifically stated? The lit review, that needs to be assessed. So how can you assess a lit review? That's a little tough at your level of study and master's level, but you're going to look whether it's exhaustive enough. Is it too short? Should it have been more detailed? You're going to look at whether it's out of date, because sometimes it's out of date. It should really only focus in the last 10 years of literature, sometimes even the last 5 years of literature, if it's a really contemporary topic. If you talk about technology, for example, there's not much point going back 10 years. You can focus on just 5 years. You're going to want to see that every subtopic has actually been looked at. So if I have a question which looks at gender, the difference in gender achievement in the K-12 sector, I am going to have to look at what we qualified as achievement. I'm going to have to look at different discussions around gender. I'm probably also going to have to narrow down my literature review and looking at, am I looking at the global south or global north? I'm then going to see if there's any literature that overlaps between achievement, school achievement, and gender. I'm probably going to have to look very quickly at gender, not just in terms of students, but gender in terms of teachers, right? You see how very quickly around the themes, you have a whole bunch of themes which really need to be mentioned, and you need to actually, even concisely, but you would need to actually give a little bit of literature to help the audience understand the context in which you're working. So exhaustiveness, has all that been tackled? Clarity, is it written in a clear way? Or sometimes it uses jargon and it gets sort of pedantic. Is it concise? It should be accessible to the layperson. You don't have to be a specialist to understand the lit review. You should actually be able to make it accessible to anyone. When it comes to the theoretical perspective, well, a quick assessment at your level and master level is to say, is it there? Is it clear? Is it appropriate? Is the theoretical lens seem pertinent in the circumstances? Again, theory, I know you've just finished your course on theory. Theory can never be proven or disproven. It's not held against data. It's actually a lens. It's like wearing a pair of glasses. It's you wear, you adopt or you embrace a theory, and it gives you an outlook on data. So therefore, you are not using data to prove or disprove a theory. So theory is, don't critique it in the sense of saying, is it suitable? Is it proven or not proven? It's more, is it just a suitable lens for what you're trying to look at, for the problem the phenomenon you're trying to look at. Then you have methodology. As I said, you have two sections with methodology: is data collection, data analysis. Take the time to look at whether, and you can assess it in simple terms, is the data collection method explained in layperson's terms? Does it seem adequate? Does it seem pertinent? Do you see any loopholes? Do you see any where the research has been blindsided and there are issues that they've not thought of in terms of data collection? And then data analysis. Be careful, because we're in a hurry to publish in higher education, and often we will rush to publication before we finish the full analysis. So often you will see that authors don't always finish their data analysis, and that's a big critique. Because if you've done the data collection but you're not bothered to actually analyze it, that's work in progress. That's not actually leading to conclusions. Sometimes also, if people are using qualitative methods of inquiry, which are really interesting, sort of ethnography methods which include a lot of descriptions, sometimes this is great because you collect an awful lot of data, right? You could have long descriptions on something you observed. You could have long transcripts of people you've been engaged in interactions with. But that's not data analysis. That's just presenting the data. And in qualitative methods, you want to present a flavor of what you've done. So you are going to want to present extracts and a window into your data methods methods of data collection. But you are also going to want to have a section that actually fully pulls that analysis to the end. So a part that's not descriptive and actually says, this is actually what's emerging from the data itself, even if it's qualitative. And then you have your outcomes or discussion session. So that's where you're going to assess the pertinence. You're going to go back to the purpose of the article, to your first section. Have those goals been achieved? And then you're going to assess the relevance to the audience, to the public, because in that intro section, you probably, specifically the author probably identified a target audience, right? This is going to be helpful for this audience, for parents, for teachers, for students. In the outcomes, you actually go back to that and say, how pertinent has it been for its audience? And how pertinent is it to the field? Is it advancing learning? Is it advancing our understanding of the phenomena that's been studied? So that's it. It's fairly straightforward. Now, in terms of order, when you write this, when you start off, if you've never done a critical review of a journal article, I would suggest you actually follow the order of the sections. And so you assess them in order. As you get more comfortable and you become more elegant and you are able to take some freedom and actually do things in a different order, if you feel like that's what you want to do, feel free to rearrange your sections. You don't have to follow the skeleton of the article. But it's in terms of safety, if you don't want to get too sophisticated, too sort of elegant, there's nothing wrong with sticking to just a systematic process through all the sections in the order that we expect to find them. Tone. So this is really important. We can sometimes be very critical, not in a critique sense, but critical in a negative sense of the journals that we are reviewing. And sometimes we can be very abrupt. There's an etiquette, there's a convention around the review of journal article. Because if we relate this back to a real life exercise, it's an exercise that we do an awful lot. Because if you're asked to review, to be a peer reviewer for a journal, that's exactly what you're going to be doing. You're going to have a form that looks pretty much like what I've just described. You're going to be ticking boxes on scales, sort of requires, is accepted, all the way down to accepted with minor, accepted with major revisions, not accepted. For first, you normally have resubmit with a full rewrite or reject. So that the exercise that you're doing here mimics an exercise that you do as scholars all the time in academia. And when we do this, part of that review normally is visible to the author. So there's an etiquette and a convention that you are always kind. It doesn't mean that you're not to the point, and you have something to say, you say it, but you are always going to try and sugarcoat things so that you're not offensive. Because the principle is that peer review is widespread around academia, and we know that you may well be sitting at a conference sometimes with the person whose work you have reviewed. So you will never put yourself in a situation where you are being so hurtful that you might not be able to face the person afterwards. Now, you might still say that the article is, complete crap, but you're not going to say it in those terms. So you're going to be very polite. So you're going to, it's an exercise of language. You have to develop that tone where you're able to say, the reader might be astonished, not to be finding, so you're going to have to be very sort of to circumvent the statements that you want to make, and make them with a bit of elegance and fluidity, so that they're still there, but they're not hurtful, right? They look like you're objectively sort of assessing. It's always good as well, whichever way you're doing it, whether you're doing it in a systematic order I've described or you're moving the sections around, it's always useful to focus on something really positive, especially if the article is really bad. You focus on something positive and you bring it to the end so that you finish on a positive note. That's normally a convention as well, right? You don't want to finish on a tone saying this has been pointless. There usually is something good, whether it's the lit review itself, or whether there's something that's been attempted with a methodology that's useful. So you're always going to want to drag that till the end so you can conclude on a positive note. So do you highlight what is actually worth reading or why it's worth reading the piece. The tone and other conventions that you are supposed to be objective for this. So you never use the first person in a review of a journal article. It's these things are changing now in terms of your own writing, but in a review, you are meant to be really objective and neutral. So you're not a person. You're assessing as a peer. You're not assessing as a person. So no first person. That's a convention that you're not going to be able to get away from. And that's it. So maximum 1,000 words. I don't think you're going to make it to 1,000 words. Normally you'll be around 600, 700 max. It's really a good way of developing your mind around this skill, which again is something that you do throughout academia if you're a scholar. So I'm going to post this now. If you've got any questions, get back to me, and I'm happy to have a look at them before you submit. If you want a quick advice on whether you've ticked all the boxes. But if you follow this, you should be fairly safe. Okay, speak to you soon.